Kathleen Olive, and welcome to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. Michelangelo is an acknowledged master artist, and yet only a handful of his paintings on panel survive. One of the most complete and influential for centuries of artists is his Doni Tondo, painted in 1507 and now in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. In this episode, Freya Middleton, an art historian and specialist art guide in Florence, talks to Limelight Arts Travels' Dr. Nick Gordon about this work. It's fascinating to uncover how an artist who consistently defined himself as a sculptor innovates in composition and colour and brings a sculptural aesthetic to an intimate family painting.
Well, hi, Freya. Thank you for coming in again to speak to us about another masterpiece of Italian Renaissance art, Michelangelo's Doni Tondo. So this is quite a rare work of Michelangelo's. Perhaps as an interesting place to start, you could tell us why this is the only work of Michelangelo's of this type.
It's a painting. So, Michelangelo viewed himself as a sculptor. However, he signed for a decade, 2 decades. He signed his letters Michelangelo Sculptor. He believed sculpture was his God-given talent. But the basis of all of the arts, architecture, painting, sculpture, is draftsmanship, and he's said to be one of the greatest draftsmen to ever lived. So, of course, he also was a painter and indeed started off his artistic career at the age of 13 in Ghirlandaio's workshop, the leading painter at the time in the second half of the 1400s in Florence. However, what's interesting about this is that now it's the only completed existing painting by Michelangelo that we have. He did do some others, but they have not survived. And then there's also an incomplete work of his in the National Gallery in London, the so-called Manchester Madonna. So, it is something indeed that he did very little in comparison to sculpture. Absolutely. And then also architecture. And if you're thinking of something else, it's fresco. And he did fresco in St. Peter's in the Vatican, in St. Peter's Basilica, in the Sistine Chapel. And also there is a chapel commissioned by Pope Paul III, the so-called Pauline Chapel as well. But this is his only painting. It was commissioned in the early years of the 1500s, just after he did sculpted the David statue, which he finished in 1504. And let's say it's maybe about done 2 years later. The dating is not entirely certain, but we know who commissioned it. Wealthy Florentine merchant called Agnolo Doni commissioned this painting. This is, again, a painting that needs to be said immediately, that is for a domestic sphere, not for a church or a religious context. It is, and we know that immediately when you look at it because of its shape. These round paintings, called tondos from the Latin word round, and not only is it for a domestic sphere, but also from a Florentine patron, because it was Florentine tradition when you have a baby, to celebrate the birth of a baby in your family, to commission a circular painting to hang on your wall. The symbol of the circle is infinity. So you have, in that way, prolonged the immortality of your family with the wonderful birth of a baby. So that's why you see so many of these in Florence, but also in any of the major museums around the world, wherever you are. If you do see a round painting from the late 13 to the early 1500s of a baby scene, such as this is the Holy Family, Joseph, Mary, and Christ. It might be a nativity scene. It might be the Adoration of the Magi is another scene that you see often, and typically also by a major painter. Of course, this started off in the late 13 and the early 1400s. These were circular trays that you would present to the new mother with gifts on it, say fruit in season, lovely flowers, to present to the new mother, indeed, for the birth of the baby. And these trays were beautifully decorated by the artists with these baby scenes. But then, of course, one-upmanship, typical, merchant competition. Throughout the 1400s, they get bigger and bigger trays. Then they get bigger and bigger wall paintings. So when you get up to about 1506, which is the date that's thought for this painting, Michelangelo is commissioned by Agnolo Doni and his wife Maddalena Strozzi from the wealthy Strozzi family. They live on Corso dei Tintori in the Santa Croce area, and they commissioned the superstar Michelangelo because, David really shoots him to fame 2 years later. I mean, he's got a lot of things on the boil in these years. He does David, he's doing the Sienese, the Piccolomini family have commissioned him to do their family altar inside the Sienese cathedral. 2 other families, the Taddei family and the Pitti family, have commissioned him to do bas-relief sculptured tondos for their home. I mean, he's got a lot of things going on.
So why does he, if he's got so much work, he's got more than enough that he can actually do, why does he accept this commission when it's in a medium that he doesn't enjoy using, though evidently he is a brilliant painter?
I guess probably, that's an excellent question. I view that, like anyone who has a partita IVA or an ABN, you never know if, you can't put all your eggs in one basket, and you never know if someone's going to pay and if someone's going to go bankrupt, and then, then the commission will fall through. So I do think that you accept probably when you work for yourself more gigs than you probably should. And also as well, whilst he will say that and sign his letters, as I mentioned, Michelangelo sculptor, he is a universal artist and is from the school of Florence, which has its very foundation in disegno, in draftsmanship. And so I think that in that respect, the clear drawn line that he'll only dedicate him to sculpture possibly is too simple to actually state. Also, looking at this painting, because it's prestigious, Agnolo Doni was one of the wealthiest merchants in Florence, married to the historically important Strozzi family, and Michelangelo did like a certain status as well, didn't he? And so another, adding that name to the list on your CV is not bad. Piccolomini family, Strozzi, etc., Republic of Florence, Cathedral, etc. And looking at his work, can you actually see that essentially looking at this, it is sculptured painting, isn't it? The figures have this unbelievable, sculptured sense of strength and grandiosity, and he is also looking very strongly, as most of them did, at sculpture. Lastly, I just wanted to add as well, in a way, this is the response to Leonardo in these years. Leonardo, who believed that of all the arts, painting was the superior one, and Michelangelo, who does really see himself as a sculptor, wanted to also then, do almost a way of painting that counteracted the one that everyone was looking at Leonardo at the time. Leonardo with the unbelievable depth of shadow. Leonardo who completely dissolved the line, the contour of 15th century painting to this sfumato technique. And this is almost Michelangelo's response to that style of Leonardo. Hard line, sharp contour, sculptured effect, shot colours, this highly saturated colouring, which Leonardo da Vinci, think of the Mona Lisa, done exactly the same year, absolutely polar opposite in the hues and tonal qualities. So it's almost his response, to that kind of competition with Leonardo.
And then there's all that love of the showing the human body in outlandish postures, trying to accentuate the torsion, which is something that tends to appeal more to sculptors than to painters, who are more likely to show people lying back in elegant lethargic positions. Whereas in this case, it's almost like Joseph's arm turns into Mary's arm. It's growing out of it as she leans over his thigh with the arm back to collect or to pick up the baby. If you try and put your own body in that position, you have to be able to move it. She's been doing a lot of yoga or Pilates or something to be able to to hold that position. But it's almost like he's showing off his understanding of human anatomy and just how far a human body can be pushed in a certain direction before it becomes impossible.
Absolutely, 100%. It's so interesting. Absolutely. And speaking of that wonderful point you made of the arm of Joseph that then, runs into the arm of the Virgin Mary. Absolutely shocking. Talking of the innovation, absolutely shocking. No one had ever seen the Virgin Mary's arm before, and so here it is, almost like the kind of spinning wheel of the Tondo, that it becomes, that folk draws you right into the painting, and people would have been shocked they'd never seen it before. And this wonderful use of the foreshortening. And speaking of then, look at the way in which he absolutely mimics with the foreshortening and the position with the Christ baby's arm as well. So you've got this real kind of, this connection between mother and child. And also, I do love as well the way in which the Virgin is inserted within the legs of Joseph, just like he did with the Bruges Madonna, which he's carving in exactly the same time period in sculpture. And I have to say, it does live rent-free in my mind, this wonderful concept that Timothy Verdon put forth, the Monsignor of the Florentine Cathedral, American and great art historian, and he put forth this concept that this was not Joseph. Now, indeed, Joseph, we said it was the Holy Family, Joseph, Mary, and Christ. The man at the back has the attributes of Joseph, who typically is always shown much older and wearing orange. However, what's really interesting is that when you show a Holy Family, most of the time, or an Adoration of the Magi, Joseph is always quite distant from the Madonna and Child, precisely underlining that it is a virgin birth, that, Joseph had nothing to do with this. Technically, he's almost like the babysitter of them both, and so you've got this physical distance. But here, she's seated within between the two legs. And also Timothy Burton put forth that this is not Joseph, but it's actually God himself. And I have to tell you, I just love this theory that God is passing Christ down to the Virgin Mary, and she's turning around and taking him down, bringing him down almost from heaven, and then accepting then that next stage of his earthly transition. So here she is turning by and not ever looking at it, not ever seeing God, but then bringing that Christ child down.
It's almost an annunciation. It's kind of almost the moment of conception.
Absolutely. And indeed, he called it was the moment of Mary's conception. That's exactly right. And so his theory was that because it's believed, it's understood from documents that there are, that this family had trouble conceiving and had some types of miscarriages prior, this painting could have been commissioned, not to celebrate the birth of a baby, but this kind of auspicious good omen in the hope that something will happen. And indeed, it just so happens that their first child is a daughter in 1507, and they called her Mary. She was born on the 8th of September, which is the day that they celebrate the birth of Mary.
Push that idea a little bit further as well. The positioning of them, especially in relation to that background, and we can come to kind of the nude figures. But you have that kind of that hemisphere in the background, almost that amphitheatre quality, which is the only kind of stony area where it's green behind, it's stony there. The foreground is green and verdant as well. But that foreground to me looks like it's anchored, or Mary is anchoring the painting in that as that it's her hips and her legs, which are turned up in the opposite direction from her, where she's turning to collect the baby, are providing the weight and the mass that kind of grounds us in the green moment in the foreground, and not the kind of the stone amphitheater with all the naked guys standing around. It seems to amplify, and that would kind of seem to, just as an idea, or as theoretically, that would seem to then place more weight on the male figure passing the baby forward, because he's between those two zones, as almost as if he's moving from one zone to the other.
I mean, it's, it always reminds me of, the new version of the old Wizard of Oz, when she steps out from Kansas and out of the house and into the coloured, land of Oz. And here we can see indeed those, absolutely, this kind of stone hedge that they're leaning on, and people have debated, what does this mean? And is it this type of is it the baptism of the neophytes? Do they represent indeed that Old Testament idea, and that here they are waiting for the water to come on so that they'll be cleansed and purified? Do they represent therefore the anti-legem man before the law, because they are half coloured. They seemingly unfinished, or they faded in comparison to the beautifully highly polished finish of the figures in the foreground. So could it represent absolutely that journey, like you're saying? So the people in the background represent the before the law of Moses. Then you have that middle ground with John the Baptist on the right hand side, remembering that this is a Florentine painting. So John the Baptist is a patron saint of Florence, shown little, as the Florentines love to do, a little boy. But how can you tell it's John the Baptist? Because he's wearing his attribute of the camel fur, and he's holding his staff on his shoulders, and he's looking forward. Here's that kind of gap, that bridge between that Old Testament and that New Testament. And then indeed the kind of coloured, beautiful, illuminated, shining, dynamic foreground. Speaking of the colouring, which is just, again, so innovative and would have knocked the socks off, the viewer of the early 1500s. Look at how Michelangelo, unlike Leonardo, doesn't mix his colours, doesn't blend at all. I love just staring at these colours and seeing that he literally has on Joseph's, or God's, robe, black against yellow, and, orange against a luminous yellow. And then looking at the Virgin Mary's blue, again, you've got the black next to blue, unbelievable virtuosity to be able to pull this off, and make it look naturalistic within, kind of inverted commas, something that is vibrant, realistic, let's say, not naturalistic, but realistic, considering that it's highly unnatural in its rendering.
Yes. Yeah. And kind of the more you look at it, there's just the more is going on, and the way that those colors amplify one another, whether it's through kind of different, I suppose, complementary contrasting or simultaneous contrasting. But you're right, it's also just when you're used to seeing color being very gently blended, as we do for a century before this, the focus has been kind of softening out the play of light. Here it looks like he's put the spotlight on. It's kind of, he's editing on his phone and he's just put the contrast on full. It has that sort of almost hyper-real quality to it that makes it both very realistic, but also somehow otherworldly.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's the bigness of the bodies, kind of speaking of this hyper-realness, this love for the grandiosity of the bodies, the strength and so forth. It just gets bigger and bigger the further he is throughout his career. And really you see that kind of change after the David, so only 2 years earlier. And really it's kind of in a way, which is why they date this at 1506 as well, because that naked body that's basically just to the right of Joseph's shoulder, in that particular position of that body, is linked to one of the sons of the Apollon priest, Laoconte, of the wonderful 3-person part sculptural complex from antiquity, which was just pulled out of the ground in early 1506. And Michelangelo's, world kind of, it was probably an epiphany moment for Michelangelo to see this unbelievable classical Hellenistic sculptural group that he'd read about. People were talking about being one of the most amazing sculptural groups to ever be made in the classical world. And here they have it, pulled out of the ground in this unbelievable pathos, the strength of the body, what it can be pushed to, and how he can show that wonderful sense of energy. And, then his work gets, more and more, he embraces this idea and that symbolic representation of what the greatness that man can do on earth when he taps into his personal interior greatness. And here you can see that Madonna, as we said, is showing with the arm and the strength of her forearm and so forth, and Christ and so forth. So you've got this wonderful kind of hypernaturalism, hyperrealism that you were talking about, but then these beautiful natural touches when you're talking about the perfect position that she's in, even though she's unbelievably supple, but the perfect position. I love those little toes on the bottom. I've always loved that when you do sit like that and you crunch your toes, so sometimes they cramp a little bit. They fold like that though. So it's these incredibly kind of grounding elements that Michelangelo has in his work that keep it on the ground. So you feel this sense of energy, you feel this dynamism that he manages to convey with the greatness of man, but then he's always got these beautiful nods to realism, in his work, just the art of one of the greatest draftsmen to have ever lived.
And that in that sense, I suppose it kind of represents the way that he can be both so incredibly philosophical and kind of in his writings, his spirituality, in his painting, but to be trying to express something as subtle as philosophy and to use marble as your chosen medium. I think it's almost at the far opposite end of the spectrum from an abstract idea, but to be able to capture those ideas in stone is wonderful. But I think you've shown us today too how the way he thinks about art, the way he approaches it, makes this work consistent with where he will go, with where he's been and where he'll go with the works of his we're more familiar with.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much for coming in to talk to us about this masterpiece, Freya, and we look forward to having you on again soon.
Thanks so much, Nick.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.